All right, everybody. Welcome back to Mad's Monday Morning Podcast. And I have a very special guest this week. We have Zoomer Nation.
Yes, hello.
Um, do you mind if I call you Alia for the
Yeah, sure.
show? Okay.
Either one is totally fine.
She, her pronouns, by the way. Don't misgender her in the comments. But, we wanted to have a discussion partly about morality.
Right,
Um, like philosophical morality.
right. Whether morality is like objective. Uh,
Right. Because I'm like a moral nihilist in that question where I just think that morals are like incapable of being objective things. But what's your perspective on that?
so like could you like elaborate upon like what you define as moral nihilism? Because like there's various ways to like look at morality from a subjective lens. Like you might totally reject any moral framework. Is that what moral nihilism means or
Well, by that I simply mean like no single framework is objectively true. They're all
okay, yeah,
yeah.
that definitely makes sense. So I believe in objective morality, although like I'm not like completely settled on this, but I think that I've seen convincing epistemological like arguments in favor of an objective morality, but like I have a very layman perspective. I'm not like some philosophy expert, but like yeah, I think that there are objective moral values independent of, human beings or independent of the material reality that exists.
Okay, so elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. So, like, the way I see it, every ethical system um, appeals to utility to one extent or another, in the sense that, like, even if you're a Kantian deontologist, you think that, having these duties, these moral duties, will lead to a positive outcome. Like, obviously, if there wasn't an outcome to rape or murder or whatever, you're essentially like making it toothless. Like the implication of murder is its consequences. Like it's in the embryo of murder or rape. So like I think that everyone is trying to appeal to utility to one degree or another, virtually every ideological framework. But the reason I think that morality is objective is because I think that it serves the most utility to assume its objectivity. Because like if you say raping a child is objectively immoral, there's more foundational reason for somebody to, you know, act out the moral goal of not raping children or the moral goal of not murdering somebody if it's objective, if it's like an intrinsic law. Whereas if it's just an opinion and a subjective sort of preferential like ethical framework, I don't think there's the same onus to do so. And I think we can start there. Sure.
So, what I hear when you say that is basically like you would rather these things be considered objective, but like
Well,
you
so
haven't
like
like
we don't.
proven that they are is my problem with that.
I hear this. Yeah, I hear this objection like pretty often. Like the way I see it is we can't know for certain whether or not morality is objective. Like it's a non-quantifiable concept. It's, you know, a non-physical concept in the sense that like, we're appealing to abstracts. But I think that assuming its objectivity, like if we're not sure, we ought to assume its objectivity because it serves human like purpose. Like it serves our interest as a species to assume its objectivity. And like it's like medicine, okay? Like, you know, I hate to like appeal to Sam Harris, but like he makes this like don't worry, I don't apply his ethical framework, but like in one of his books, he's like, we don't, we just assume that we value medicine when we're sick because like, people universally don't want to be sick. So that's the function of medicine. It's like sort of like an intrinsic function of medicine. Whereas like with ethics. Like if you talk to a Christian or like a fundamentalist of any sort, like extensively, you're going to appeal to, well-being when you go down to it. Like when you go down to the wire, like they think that this is the system that will, produce the best results. So like there's this sort of universal like intrinsic value, but like um if you want, I can like explain my like framework for objective morality, but you can address that point or whatever.
Okay, well, yeah, you can keep going.
All right. So you want me to like just you want me to like give a framework for how I can demonstrate or like how I demonstrate an objective morality?
Yes, please.
Right, because like I was just like explaining why I value objective morality, but like yeah, I can give my framework. So basically, look at like the law of non-contradiction, right? Or the law of identity. Like those are like intrinsic metaphysical concepts. Like God, like a transcendental being like God, but even he has to submit to the law of non-contradiction. For example, God, there cannot be something above God because God is all-knowing and all-powerful. It contradicts the very essence of God. Like it's a almost like it's an unbeatable like law that's intrinsic within the universe, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and so forth. So we know that there are concepts that exist with a transcendental character because like there's a sort of way to understand that no conceivable concept that you can develop can contradict those very notions and those very ideals. And I think you can utilize the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction and so forth to build an ethical framework as to how we should govern our behavior and how we should govern our conduct and so forth. And I assume it's objectivity, the same reason why we objectively value reason when we're engaging in inductive scientific research. This is an argument that some deontologists, including myself, adhere to, which is the argument of you know the guilt in companion argument. So if you reject objective morality, how can you why do you not reject like reason as a concept? Because like reason, like I can subjectively say I don't care about reason. Okay, like this is the problem I have with Vosh's ethical system, his rejection of epistemological like truth. Like Vosh cannot tell a Holocaust denier that he's objectively wrong because that Holocaust denier could just say reject truth as a concept. Like I don't value that. We generally tend to assume like we take some epistemological concepts for granted. Like we assume truth should be valued because it seems like an obvious axiomatic claim to make. But if you reject truth or if you reject epistemology and its objectivity, I don't think you can really function as human beings. And I think in that same token, why reject objective morality when we value other things which cannot be materially established would be my question.
Well, simply because like I don't think that there are specific values that every sentient being or like every human being has. I just think that we intrinsically value values and we all have like different configurations of those. And usually what that is it's heavily influenced by the societal context that we are raised in and the ideology that we're inculcated within. So it's sort of like my perspective on it is basically like we're given these codes and we're told that they're objective simply as a measure of controlling us.
Okay, yeah. So I think that a controlling ethical system, like one that tries to subordinate or like coerce people, like I think that I reject that because I operate with a very Hegelian ethical framework. So like I don't believe in like, I think that freedom is an end in and of itself in terms of our ethical progression and development. I think that I agree that, there is the superstructure that exists which promotes certain ethical frameworks to control people and to subjugate people. But I think negation of oh sorry, my Discord notifications are going crazy. Um, all right. So I So I agree with you that we do need to reject, ethical systems that can't justify themselves and seem like they just exist to, coerce people and like subordinate people. But I do believe that, like a clock, for example, like we say the clock ought to, do X, it ought to tell the time. From a naturalist perspective, we say a tree ought to grow and provide, you know, oxygen for human beings. Like there's intrinsic ought function to characters, and I know this might seem like an appeal to naturalism, but a part of the Hegelian philosophy is that these are sort of these physical representations are part of a broader like they serve a broader function and they like serve like these meta processes. They're not just physical oriented objects. And I think as human beings, our function is to be free and as to flourish as much as possible because morality is a term like it's not just this abstract, non-definable concept. Like we can define morality as, when you look at the roots of the term, I think it's ethicos and so forth. And what it means is essentially like, what is the good life? Introspection about what is the good life, reflecting on that. Like that's the origin and like the genesis of the term morality. And I think that you can like understand the function of morality and from that derive an ought claim. And I justify that ought claim because if we reject all metaphysical concepts because they're not falsifiable, then we live in a chaotic sort of dystopia, I almost want to say. So
Okay, so it's I see the value that you see in like having a objective framework because it's like convenient and because it serves what we would consider positive like social ends. But I don't my issue is like when it comes to the idea of it literally being objective because it just doesn't seem like I just like when people say something is good or something is bad, I don't to me that just seems like a subjective observation, like it has to be instead of like a objective claim.
all right, I see where you're coming from here. So like, do you believe that truth is like a self-justifying act? Like you can't negate truth, right? As a concept.
Well, what do you mean by what concept of truth?
Like in order to negate truth itself, you're gonna have to contradict yourself because like me saying I reject truth, like that's a truth statement. So like you run into this contradiction, right? So like do you think like truth like itself like intrinsically is something that is objective and like you can like substantiate like if you like put out a piece of paper you can substantiate why truth is intrinsically valid.
Well, I could probably create a concept of truth, but like different people believe different things are true and then like it's you know what I mean? Like it's all kind of like I would need there would need to be things that like literally every single subject agrees with for me to say okay, this gets the validation of it being an objective thing.
This is a very common argument that you have in philosophical circles, the argument that how can there be like the ability to quantify an objective morality when people have different opinions, right? Like a certain culture might say female genital mutilation is okay, another culture might not. One culture might say, tax the rich, another culture might say that's immoral. So I get that, but I think it's somewhat of a non sequitur in the sense that like two plus two equals four. Like somebody might say two plus two equals five, but like just because there's a disagreement about a math problem or like about something that's objectively like falsifiable or whatever doesn't mean there can't be an objective truth. Like just because X disagrees with Y doesn't mean there can't be an objective, you know, truth that we can come to a conclusion to using, a particular like epistemic methodology or whatever.
I'm very hesitant to accept that.
Are you like a complete like epistemic anti-realist? Like you don't even think anything can be objectively grounded. Like is that your framework of analysis?
I trend towards that direction, but like when I look at society and I have my like takes on things, it's from a very like not in the technical like literary sense, but very like deconstructive. Like I'm trying to expose the fact that like society is basically built upon a bunch of myths that like reify it. Like it's like a position of negation of things. That's like the approach that I take. So it's hard to
So very
think
like
on this level simply because I don't like I'm not interested in building a analytical framework to objectively quote unquote like quantify questions. Like I just you know what do you get what I'm saying?
yeah, I totally get like you're more of a delusion, so I can see why you're more like of a deconstructionist rather than somebody who's trying to, you know, like demonstrate an objective ethical framework to operate under. But like the way I see it, you know, if we can understand that 2 + 2 = 4, like even if like no matter exists, like it's almost a metaphysical concept in the sense that you can empty out the entire universe like completely blank and still conceptually, you know, if two things suddenly pop out and there's another two things, there doesn't need to be a consciousness to know, you know, they add up and make four. Like it's
But
like an objective metaphysical reality. I
But
think that can
wait, but
too.
doesn't there? Because like the concepts of the numbers 2 and 4 were human inventions to explain the phenomenon of there being what we call two things and four things. So there has to be the language to say it, and there has to be the conceptual ground to actually say that. Even if, like, I think that our human ideas and concepts we used to interpret things are different things than the things in reality that we're actually looking at.
Okay, so here's so I agree with you from a linguistic perspective. Like all terminology is subjective in the sense that it's human constructed. Like, you know, the term sex is a social construct because it's a human made term. The colors, pink, purple, whatever, it's a human construct. So on a linguistic level, I agree. Like that terminology, two and two, is a social construct if you deconstruct it. But it I don't think the two and the two is what's relevant. Like I don't think the linguistic component is what's relevant. I think what it describes, like the concepts it describes that we can visually recognize and understand. I think that there's a sort of level of objectivity to it. For example, if no human beings existed, like you know, the earth was empty, you know, there's trees, there's so forth. Like there's still going to be those same objects on the earth. We just aren't there. Like we aren't there to descriptively explain it with the terminology we have, but that doesn't change the concrete nature of that reality. So like I agree with you like in the technical sense of the terminology and the sort of linguistic deconstruction, but I think that it doesn't negate a sort of broader, you know, metaphysical description that is independent of human consciousness, essentially.
I don't I As long as you're not saying that the like the concepts that we create out of the reality that we observe as humans exist outside of us, like in the thing itself, because I don't agree with that.
Okay, so I agree with you. I agree with you that. Okay, could you restate your statement so I can like better understand it?
Well, like for an example, like um just like the numbers, like if you have like two of something, like what we would call that, I wouldn't say that our concept of there being two things exists independent of us. I think it's just very inculcated subjective truth. I don't think that it's like a objective thing.
Okay, so like if there's two pencils on my desk, okay, or like two pencils on your desk or whatever, you think that like that is purely a conscious sort of construct, like the intrinsic, you know, existence of those entities.
Well, what I think is like you need a concept of there being two things in order for you to recognize that there are two things there, or else
Okay,
you could yeah.
so like that, yeah, I think my previous point essentially acknowledges your point. Like, yeah, I agree with you on the linguistic descriptive context. Like, obviously, linguistics is not an, thing that exists independent of human beings, like the way we describe things. But I think that physical objects in and of themselves serve a particular function in the development and the progression of, time and, for example, like, it's like the Hegelian concept, where as you develop, you reach absolute knowledge when you realize that everything external to you is unified with you. Like it's a reflective of who you are as an individual. The unity of seeming opposite. I think those Hegelian concepts are like intrinsic, like they're part of the human development and the steps and movements forward. If you know what I'm saying.
Okay. Do you want to go more into those or?
Yeah, sure. Do you have like any particular skepticism of what I'm saying in terms of like intrinsic, like things intrinsically serve end goal? Like, do you disagree with like that premise that I'm operating with?
I think certain things could intrinsically serve an end goal. I just don't think that any sort of value judgment upon it is like objectively uh, available.
Okay, yeah. So the way I see it is, freedom in a freedom, like absolute freedom in a Hegelian context, is like, what we as human beings, by understanding the world in its totality, that's what we're trying to achieve. And um, it's not like this sort of anarchist conception of freedom, like, free to do whatever you want and, rock on, or like, that's a straw man. I mean, a very like vulgar anarchist interpretation of freedom, but like, freedom in a Hegelian context is understanding the totality of the world around you and developing deontological like duties in order to be free. Because like if you're a heroin addict, okay, you're taking like many doses of heroin and you're junking yourself or whatever the term is, like ruining yourself or whatever, that's not true genuine freedom, because you don't have control over your own impulses and you don't have control over your own faculties to make rational decisions. And the freedom from a Hegelian perspective is that end state of humanity as this conscious being fully consciously grasping reality in its totality in order to bring to fruition those foundational like principles that are necessary to be free, like in a true genuine sense or whatever.
So Hegelian freedom in the concept that you're discussing is a state of consciousness.
In a very simplified sense, yeah, but like it's a sort of sense of this great like it's not like it's not just pure individual consciousness. It's like this um it's a complicated concept. It's like this acknowledgement of a universal sort of reality, like how you reflect yourself in others, how you reflect various objects in yourself, like the totality of the world in yourself. Because when you fully grasp it in that interpersonal level, then you can make the absolute moral judgments. And human beings, the development of civilization is trying to grasp a particular absolute truth, or it's moving closer towards an absolute truth that's like all encompassing in a sense.
Okay. I see what you're saying and it's interesting. But I've never like gone into this myself.
That's fair. That's fair. I, I mean, I'm like I said, I'm very layman. Like I read a few books on Hegel. I haven't like looked into the phenomenology or like the science of logic or whatever, even though I plan to. So like this is like a very, not the best way to like articulate the points, but like that's just the general outline of the way I see historical development and like ethical development and like the way the sort of the answer to Hume's law, the ought distinction, like trying to put a gap to it by acknowledging that naturally, there's a natural ethic that exists because of the intrinsic function of different physical objects that, are merely metaphors for an abstract reality or an abstract truth, in and of itself.
Hmm.
Like I can give an analogy, like maybe to like better visualize it, because I feel like I'm sounding like really pretentious and cringe, and I feel like
No, it's
it's not.
I love like philosophical talk. Like I like it. It's fine.
All right, all right. So like a tree, like a set of trees in a forest, like they there's no like consciousness to those trees in a forest. Like there's no, it's pure, a natural progression. And these trees, like they could easily selfishly, take all the nutrients for themselves, or like, grow out and destroy all the, various other trees and not perpetuate themselves. But what you see as a phenomenon from a naturalist perspective is like trees often, share sunlight, share nutrients. They, go in certain proximities to get the best outcomes from a particular weather or climate or situation, because it's like naturally without any, ability to make ethical statements. Obviously you see this sort of natural behavior, and you could say that's just a natural phenomena and it's just a reaction to stimuli. But from a Hegelian perspective, that would be more of a, an end to itself. That tree has an intrinsic function, the same way how human beings have an intrinsic function, the same way how, the reality itself, is more of a picture of a broader abstract or whatever.
Okay, so can I ask you what the intrinsic functions of humans are in this perspective?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think that what's critical, the most important like critical starting point to get Hegel would be his philosophy of history, because that's where you have to start to really grasp, the function and the purpose of human beings as a super historical concept or confine. Like Hegel sees history as like made up of these. I don't fully agree with him, but like he sees history as made up of these great figures that really propel forward and perpetuate, broader behaviors, which, develop towards this end. And for Hegel, when you look at historical development, it seems to be a develop okay, so we can start with Greek civilization. Okay, he saw this sort of harmony in Greek civilization where essentially there was harmony even though human beings were not conscious actors who were able to make moral reflections. Like they basically saw themselves simply as a function of the state, like functionary of the state. And that's why there was this sort of harmony in Greek civilization to Hegel. And then post Greek civilization, there's a sort of negation where, we move away from seeing ourselves identified through the state apparatus, where we see ourselves more as independent, conscious beings. But, you know, it creates a sort of period of chaos where the harmony, dissolves. And Hegel doesn't necessarily see that as a bad thing. Like Hegel simply sees it as like a historical development. But the aim is, for there to be a reconciliation. There's the meme of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, people who, don't really fully grasp the Hegelian concept. But we can just, for the lack of a better term, just for like a layman sense, we can use that terminology. So like the synthesis would be the consciousness of human beings having a collective character, because the negation is, the move away from Greek civilization. So when the consciousness is unified with the collective, like you have a collective consciousness and a solidarity, that is a true genuine freedom, a totality. Like that is the Hegel, it's a sort of a contradiction because Hegel believed in monarchist governments and so forth, but in a from a mental perspective, from like a abstract, conscious perspective, absolute freedom is an end in itself to humanity because of the way Hegel sees the historical development as it progresses, and like the way these things, the continuity that's a part of it, and all.
Okay, so there's a intrinsic human function of collective consciousness. Is the
I think it's just a condition of mankind, because like Marx in the 1844 philosophic manuscript essentially expounds on this in a more simple fashion, but like human beings are distinct. Okay, this is where we're getting into the humanism stuff that's definitely gonna crater to disagreement, but like
I want to get into that because I want to know your perspective more on this.
yeah, I know humanism is very like disliked in philosophical left-wing spaces, but like the way Marx saw it, and this is like late, it's very reflective of the the Hegelian perspective, but like human beings are distinct from other animal species because of our conscious ability to self-direct our own activity, and because like other animals, they are very atomistic in the sense that they don't have the full capacity to recognize themselves as part of a whole, as part of a totality. They more so see these intra relationships as just part of an ends to survival in an exclusive fashion, whereas humans have the capacity to have more meaningful relationships with other parts of the species because of our transcendent, conscious ability. I don't mean transcendent in a sort of meta sense. I just mean it in the sense of like above and beyond. But like because of our species being, we see this is why Marx, even though he's a moral realist, he doesn't appeal to these abstract principles of justice and so forth that anarchists often appeal to, because he sees this as an end in itself. That's the Hegelian aspect of Marx. Like he sees human solidarity as the fulfillment of our intrinsic functionary purpose. So that's essentially the way I look at it. So
Okay, how do we know that we are different from animals in that way, and how do we know that they're different from us? Because like I had this thought recently, like I feel like we don't really know what possible consciousness and belief systems animal species and even like plants have for themselves, simply because like we don't have access to them in the same way that I would imagine they don't have access to ours. Like
so I definitely understand that perspective. I also am very skeptical of empiricism. So like I'm not going to say, the scientists brain scanned, their minds, came to the conclusion that, they're a distinct species. But the way I see it, I feel like most of philosophy hinge on the Descartesian notion that like I think, therefore I am. Like that's the base premise and presupposition we operate under. Like, for example, if you don't agree with that presumption that I think, therefore I am, like you basically are in an empty void and you can't really make any philosophical assertions. You can't acknowledge any, logical law or anything. So like with the like I can't tell you for certain that I exist, or you can't tell yourself for certain that you exist, but we sort of intuitively assume it. And I wouldn't, you could tell me that like you don't think that's objective, but like I think deep down intrinsically, we all assume we are objective in the way we behave and in the way we act. Like, so, you know, the way we live our day-to-day lives, we assume that we're an objective entity. We assume that we're not just this, matrix, this object within a matrix that is being puppeteered by something else, or we're just an empty.
well, I kind of, I don't know if I don't, I don't experience day to day things as like, or day to day life as like a objective phenomenon. I do kind of experience like being pulled around by different forces and like institutions and societal influences and things like that more than like following some objectivity. I don't really care about objectivity that much.
All right, okay, that definitely makes sense. But I'd argue that that is a product of alienation. I think you know what alienation is, right? The idea that, you know, our capacity for, you know, human consciousness to flourish, our capacity to fully experience, you know, there's four components. I don't know if I remember all of them. There's nature, there's, you know, our connection to ourselves, there's our connections to the collective, and so forth. But like that alienation, I would argue, that very real human concept of alienation is what produces that sort of mindset of like wavering around, you know, but deep down, there's still a sort of objective essentiality in the sense that you really you have memories that feel real to you. You have, you know, life experiences that while they're surrounded in a sea of meaningless, abstract, nihilistic deconstruction. I'm using nihilism not in a I'm using it in a Nietzschean sense
Uh huh.
of I'm
Yeah.
not I don't mean it as in like a cool sort of, you know, negation. I mean it as in like a sort of emptiness. But like I so like I feel like that there's that sort of meaningfulness that you grasp onto, even if like obviously when you're having this abstract philosophy, I can't say, you know, I'm not even into analytical philosophy, to be honest. So like I'm not going to say with certainty, but like I think that's the assumption that I make in terms of the way I philosophically operate.
Well, I do feel something within myself, which is like, this includes like my identity, like my self conception, like my sense of myself as a being. That does feel. I would not use the word objective, but I would use the word genuine to me.
Okay, so
But the
okay,
the
so
thing about that is it um runs like directly against all of the like societal forces that I also feel myself influenced by. Like it's a very like um there was this book by this guy named Eric Fromm who was writing about how like it's one of those things about how like we used to have a society where there was like meaning and everybody knew like their quote unquote place in the world and stuff, and nobody really like questioned these things, but everybody was kind of like happier. And he argues that like we actually try to escape the quote unquote freedom that we supposedly have like in this age of history. Um, but I have a totally different perspective on it. Like I feel like I'm a completely opposite kind of person than the person that he was saying like human beings intrinsically are, because I actually do value freedom and like self conception and like the ability to define oneself like against your societal context and like freedom from institutions and things like that. Like I don't want to escape freedom. I want to achieve a level of freedom that's actually greater than the supposed market freedom of this liberal capitalist society.
I actually think what Eric I've read some of Eric from like I think what he's saying is that you know there's a sort of idolatry that goes on in a you know non-humanistic societal framework like you know like for a luxury car for example like it's a sign of status, you know, you're trying to race after status and so forth. And it, Eric from argues, you know, it's almost like a godlike character because you're transmitting things that you like you're transmitting your own identity onto external objects, like sort of like this Christian deification of, you know, who is it, Jehovah, it's Yahweh, I think, yeah, I think it's that.
Mm-hmm.
But like I think Eric Fromm is arguing that you know there's an attempt, from at least the one book I read from him, like it's an attempt to escape that sort of people are. people have this intrinsic desire to escape that landscape and be engaged in social institutions and behaviors that allow them for more full levels of expression and like creativity and like so forth. But like it's part of a human collective, not like a purely extrinsic individual sort of thing. I think that's what he's getting at.
Well, that's interesting because for me it's very individual simply because like I don't have the ability to build the types of institutions of wild creation that I would want to. But
All right. So getting into those like individual moments in your day-to-day life, like for example, like is it like what would be like examples for you of like that, just so like I can maybe look at it from an abstract philosophical sense, like what would be an example of like day-to-day, this is meaningful and it feels real even if it's not objectively real.
well, like if I'm engaging in like a creative activity.
Right. So, like, when it comes to like the creative activities and like the creative endeavors we engage in, like, don't you think, it's part of our human, don't you think it's part of our intrinsic human desire to, engage in things that sort of reflect our sort of chaotic, sort of, messy existence? Like, don't you think art is this attempt to whether it be vocalize or paint or whatever. This isn't even like a exclusively humanist concept. Like there's people like existentialists like Paul Sioran who talks about Neil Sioran. I forgot his name, but like they talk about this. But like, don't you think like those forms of expression are trying to get at something that's genuinely real? That's part of reconciling yourself with this external existence, like this sort of existential dread that is a part of our human reality, our human
Well,
existence.
it has to do with that, but I don't like I'm actually more materialist than idealist. Like I wouldn't we can get back to this later if you want, but like I wouldn't necessarily agree with the like I think therefore I am line of things. But I do think that it's like there's something of an essence there, but I think that our essences we get from however the external world is. Like it's like I don't know how to explain this well enough, but like I don't think that there's a human condition that isn't conditional and wasn't conditioned by the way that society is at any given historical moment. Like I don't think that all of that chaos that you mentioned is inherent to the human being. I think that all of those things are simply societal consequences.
I think that the sort of as far as like Descartes, I think therefore I am that yeah, I agree with you that we could probably maybe get to that later because that's like a whole very large topic, like a whole lot of, disagreement and whatnot. But like as far as like the chaos is concerned and whatever, I feel like um it's like intrinsic in the sense that you have to grapple with the fact that you're eventually going to die, a very real, you know quality, not I don't mean quality in like a prescriptively positive sense. I just mean like quality as in like a feature, like it's a feature that we have, and reconciling with that, the feeling of weakness and inevitability, that's what produces this sort of behavior where you're ending, like it's all done, this existence. I hate to sound dreadful, but like all the sophisticated, phenomenon of living and whatnot, that's just going to perish. And part of that dread, that existential, state of shock or existential state of, you know, unable to grapple with reality. I feel like that's intrinsic because death is such a real human concept. And unlike other animals, I don't think they grasp it in the same level as we do. And of course, the rebuttal to that would be that, how do you know for sure that, a cat or a dog or whatnot can't experience the same chaos of conscious reconciliation with death. And the way I look at it is that animals are still in this sort of bestial period. Like they're not developed to this. It's sort of like Bakunin's idea of like humanity and freedom, like the negation of bestial thinking is what's required, like as a prerequisite for freedom. And I think that animals don't have that ability to consciously reconcile with their demise, which is why they continue to live their life looking for like pleasures and survival and so forth without fully really having that creative capacity in terms of the way we look at them. Set aside brain scans of birds or dogs or whatever, just general superficial, like I think that's the real distinction. Not just dying, but having to consciously grasp with that death. I think that's a really you know primordial sort of human aspect of the creativity and whatnot.
Well, even the way that there's probably a functional component that is, but like even the way that we conceptualize and interpret death is socioculturally, historically contingent as well. Like
Yeah.
I think the way that I would conceptualize of the things that you're talking about, as far as their like the component of them that works within ourselves as human beings because we're human beings is unironically the concept of desire in a Deleuzian sense.
So I think that I think there's first order desires and second order desires. I think that like, you know, we're driven, there's definitely, I think that our consciousness is what develops that second order desire. So like when we think about, we're on a rough day, and we're struggling or whatnot, and we want to just, shoot some heroin into our hands or whatever. But like there's a sort of second order desire that's a product of our conscious self-reflection, that very genuine human character that allows us to analyze our first order desires and make conclusions that are best. And when you don't have that same ability to analyze your first order desires, your life is going to be different. You're going to be trapped in this sort of hedonic phase where you can't have genuine freedom because you're trapped by your impulses. And that I feel like there's a sort of, I don't fully agree with the just Deleuzian perspective. I think that you know I think that there is a sort of deeper, genuinely human element that runs through our day-to-day activities in our lives and whatnot.
Yeah, I would just say that it's like cuz by desire I mean like desiring production. Like everybody does that. Every like our with his like notion of the unconscious, it's like the unconscious is actually a productive machine. It's like it all you're creating flows. And but what I would add to this is that like the material that the unconscious uses is interpreted and received from the external societal context in the world around you. Um, but then,
Here,
but then, like you do produce things. Like I think that human beings are like dialectical machines in that sense. Does that make sense now?
yeah, and by the way, sorry if I like almost interrupt because like I need to stop doing that. Like it's a bad habit. But like um I think that like my issue is like the social institute. Like by the way, I've only read like two chapters of Anti-Oedipus, so like I'm very not equipped. I'm not the best person equipped to have the conversation. But like the way I see it, like the social institutions that control human behavior, they're partially in and of themselves a reflection of human reason. Okay, they're developed in reflection of certain human characteristics. Like the state as an entity, for example, or you take any social institution, sure, it negates certain human characters and human end goals and like certain human states of reconciliation or whatever. Like at the same time, it was created by human beings and perpetuated by human beings, and it might reflect a sort of tribalistic intrinsic quality that can contrast with a more, unified human being. But like there's contrast, there's different aspects to human nature. It's a very shady, complicated thing. And I think it's a very minimal thing. I don't think human nature is what dominates. I think that social engineering conditions human nature more so than human nature conditions social engineering. But both, I think that at the same time, there is that human nature that exists that produces these external coercive entities. And I think that negating those social entities that are coercive and so forth, just shattering them to be truly free and to be truly liberated, is simply destroying a reflection of one's most primitive self. I think that is what's reflected in the most destructive and problematic social institutions that exist.
Okay, so like I would say that even if it's something that's left over from a long time ago that is reflected within them, I would still say that it's not uh, intrinsic or natural per se. I would say that it's just like the product of the social interactions themselves more than the product of human beings themselves. Like just because like it's like a matter of form versus content. Like the form of the materialist unconscious that I just described is intrinsic, but what goes in and out of it, I think, is just completely conditional.
So this isn't actually. It's interesting that you brought up form versus content because this is one of those things Hegel tries to reconcile with. Like he essentially tries to eliminate the philosophical divide between form and content because the form itself is like a sort of an exterior manifestation of the substance itself. Like it is a representative itself. Like taking I might be diverting a little bit, but I'm not trying to. But like take the institution chattel slavery. Okay, like obviously primitive. We look at it as like disgusting and disgraceful, but I think that that dynamic is also representative of something that we internally suppress in the sense that there is a feature of human nature that seeks to control and seeks to subordinate and seeks to not see others in ourselves, not identify ourselves with others because of our domination of self-interest or whatever. I think that with these antiquated social structures and institutions, form and content wise, there's a sort of unification because the form, the form essentially manifests the substance of the internal, content itself. Is that making sense, or is that like I don't know?
It makes sense. Yeah, it's just kind of like I'm super hesitant to just say that it's human nature and not say that it was just like a attribute that was inherited from a certain societal arrangement and then repeated over and over again.
Okay, so here's the thing, like I can understand like thinking that I think that social institutions are more of an amplifier of characters that are human. Like I think that they amplify the worst or the best aspects of us, and I think that they for like they add more shades of gray or color to a more basic human nature that exists. But like I find it difficult to come to the conclusion that like human nature itself is a social product because like it seems as though in order for those social institutions to exist in the first place or have a point of genesis, there had to be fragments of human late there had to be like some human innovation for it to come into fruition in the first place that was reflective of these intrinsic impulses or like desires or so forth that are just contained within ourselves as conscious beings.
I
Like
th- I,
that's
I think that those are like they come from material advancement and material conditions. And then like you said something like the institutions amplify certain attributes within us. I would just say that the attributes within us are inherited from them and aren't don't come from us. They just come from the society, and we inherit
Okay.
it. We like internalize it.
Okay, so let's try to apply that framework, but like with the concept like freedom. Okay, like say you're a thought experiment time. Like say you're in this brutal dictatorship. You're totally isolated from the rest of the world. There's no like philosophers like you have access to who can tell you that you know this is what freedom means. There's no Kant or whatever to tell you that you need to revolt. You're just there and you're constantly perpetually oppressed and repressed by the state apparatus that's controlling you and like subordinating you. Do you think that, you know, if this institution propagandizes itself as claiming to be, fruitful or claiming to be beneficial in the most, effective way possible while being brutal and very like what's the term? I don't know, but like brutal and like horrible, but at the same time, it's trying to manufacture this propaganda to condition you to believe in its necessity for perpetuation. Do you think that you don't think human beings would have this natural predilection to want to revolt, even if there's nothing in the social conditioning that would suggest its necessity?
No, I think most of them will begin to desire their own oppression.
Okay, so like the problem is there more like you'd elaborate on that, or do you think that's
Well,
just
that's like one of the. It's funny because that's like one of the key um, ideas that comes out of anti-Oedipus. For one thing, is the fact that like societal repression produces psychic repression in the individual mind, and like even in the unconscious, which, and the thing about this is like I basically think that that explains that sort of dynamic of like people begin to desire their own oppression. It explains the reason why we still have this like atrocious capitalist mythical society, because most people are completely inculcated in its value system and ideology to the point where their very humanity is subjugated to it and then reinforces it.
okay. So like this is like I this is why I hate when Deleuzians call themselves post-Marxist because like I feel like I don't even know why they associate, I don't even know why they come to that conclusion because like it implies some degree of continuity or like like some like appeal to Marxian foundations, which I don't understand. But like look at like reflect like think of it within the context of the French Revolution. Okay, there wasn't the people who revolted were not like experts on these various classical German philosophy. Oh, to be fair, was classical German philosophy post French Revolution? I don't remember. But the point is, they weren't like thinking of philosophers advocating for liberation. Like what's famous or what's shocking is that the roots of the French working class they revolted against the state apparatus, and this is one of the things that inspired Marx himself. It inspired Hegel, and it also really influenced the way Marx looked at things. But like Hegel saw how these French, one of the reasons why Hegel, understood the significance of freedom was that as an, human quality was that he saw how these French revolutionary masses, not by listening to the, crowning philosophers in their ivory towers, not by this appeal to some abstract. Just from a pure human, intrinsic desire, they revolted against the French aristocracy and the French monarchy. They instituted these fundamental changes, and these people were not reading manuals about how to govern themselves. They
Right.
started forming their, social councils and what forth, utilizing the resources, and it's just a shocking thing. Like I don't know how that can be reconciled with this. I think that
I
the
think,
reason
well, if I tell you more, um, it can, because we also have the idea that there's always a potential for Like desire has both potentials. It has the potential of reaction and the potential of revolution. So maybe we can reconcile both of our perspectives if I agree that there's always the potential for revolutionary investments of desire that people have.
I think I don't reject the idea that, value systems condition behavior, but I think that the way I s- the way I see it, like I don't think that's incompatible with humanism. Like, for example, Guy Debord and the Situationists, like they appealed a lot to like early Marx, alienation and the loss of the human self. But they had a great model that helps explain the perpetuation of these oppressive structures that exist by saying that there's a spectacle, that's so alien to the human character, and it inculcates certain values and behaviors and expressions, and that's what reinforces the system. And ultimately Guy Debord killed himself because his own writings became integrated into the spectacle. So like I think that the
Yeah,
idea of
that's reterritorialization in my terms. Yeah. That's reterritorialization into the system by the socius, which is capital itself. Yeah.
okay, yeah. I hear the word reterritorial. Okay, I can't say it, but like, I hear a lot of Nick Land stands talk about that, and I get so confused. But like, okay, I get the gist of what you're saying. Yeah.
I don't think that we disagree so much about all of these things. I just probably put more emphasis on like people completely internalizing the status quo and then reifying it that way because I see it around me all the time.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. But like for example, I personally also see a lot of behavior that isn't really incentivized by the status quo. Like the capitalist status quo, like it incentivizes a very atomistic, selfish, very limiting human behavior. And there's definitely like examples, like even in my day-to-day lives of people who they submit to capitalist realism because I don't know what I mean by submit to capitalist realism. Capitalist realism is just a description of modern reality, but the point is like they they essentially give up in the sense that like they just submit and accept the fact that this is what things are going to be like forever. But at the same time, their human behavior, it feels as though it's not really something that is a product, at least from my experience. Some people are like this, where their behavior is not really in line with what their system is incentivizing them to behave. And I feel like there's a very sort of vulgar materialist, lens of analysis where people predict human behavior exclusively from social institutions. And that's what like one of my problems with Marxism and even some forms of Hegelianism, where they're trying to make predictions and like projections about how people act based on systems. And I think that it oftentimes leads to wrong outcomes because there is a sort of unpredictability that's a part of human conscious sort of behavior. Or
Yeah, there's a certain contradiction, of course. Like everything, you might like this idea because I've been thinking about it a lot recently, and it seems pretty Hegelian. But it seems to me that basically everything contains its own negation. Like everything is contradictory, like that.
yeah, absolutely. That's yeah, that's actually a very Hegelian concept. The idea of the idea of opposites, the fact that within every organism or within every concept there's this contradiction, this sort of for example, like Walmart. Okay, like Walmart is a product of a capitalist, free market laissez-faire system, and yet it negates that very notion because it's essentially planned sort of corporation. So like there's that sort of manifestation of that Hegelian internal contradiction, or like contradiction that exists in like virtually everything, every organism. So like yeah, I definitely value that concept.
Yeah. But I do think that like it seems to me that it's just um there's probably a better phrase than self-evident, but it just appears that way to me. The fact that like institutions don't only like literally control you by telling you what to do. They control you by like literally giving you the thoughts in your head.
Mm. Yeah, I do think that institutions definitely condition the way you behave or act, but I think there's also a partial appeal to components of human nature in the sense that, for example, a corporation wants a corporation, like one of the things that drives a corporate culture or like a capitalist environment is value indicators like this fancy car I bought, this fancy house I bought, or so forth, like as a means to showcase your status in this given society. And I think that it functions that way partially because there's this human predilection of egoistic desire, and it appeals to a very primitive and vulgar aspect of that. So, like, I think that you can still tie in a sort of intrinsic human quality and character with systems that condition human behavior. Like, there's to me, human nature is so I don't see human nature in this sort of humanist, like liberal humanist sense. I don't see it as this, rigid concept. I see it as a very flowing, very vibrant, something that's just very incomprehensible in its quality. And I think that the various aspects of human nature might clash often. I think that certain social systems really reify certain human ideals that exist intrinsically. That's the way I sort of see it.
Okay, so our difference of analysis is basically like you see it as amplification and manipulation of characteristics that are intrinsic, whereas I see it as like even the even those characteristics were transmitted into us by the external societal so it's basically literally just a difference of analytical philosophical perspective, but we agree otherwise is what I'm seeing.
Or yeah, I it's just I don't know. I don't I don't think you know two people like loving each other or like um people like in a community like really the way they interact and the way they build themselves through others, and just I don't see how this social dynamic is just exclusively a social condition where I say like there's certain like non-controllable human qualities that intervene, like certain like things that derive from the human conscious that intervene. There's a sort of I think that freedom is a human quality because freedom, the presupposition of freedom is self-consciousness. The presupposition of freedom is the ability to connect with others, to fully totally realize yourself, to reflect on the world, externally reflect on the world, to come to internal analysis. And that external is a social thing, a social phenomena, but at the same time I think that that is reconcilable with a sort of real genuine human thing that exists essentially. Yeah.
Well, I would say that the things that we experience as genuine are basically things that um, it's almost like an unconscious choice that we make between different subjective values, from my perspective. And then we say like that's the true to myself, that's who I am, this is an expression of my being. But really what happened was we made an unconscious choice between all of the different possibilities. So I would kind of agree or bounce off from your human nature perspective to say that in that sense what we could call a human nature is a multiplicity of different natures themselves.
Okay, so my question would be, where does the material derive from?
Which material?
The material that produces certain human characteristics. Say the capitalist structure and so forth. Where does that derive from?
Well, material conditions and like power structures and
S-
the ideology that reifies it. Like
oh,
it reproduces itself. It comes from itself and what came before it.
right, but like there's a point of origin to this social development, like pre-feudal, pre-slave society, pre-whatever. There has to be some genesis to this perpetuating structure, right? Like I don't think it just magically appeared. Like I think that there had to be this conscious beings actively producing that cycle. And I'm not trying to make a god of the gas argument. I'm just saying like there had to be some, you know, thing that produces a social construct. Like it can't just
Well, yeah,
come to fruition.
it's um are you pointing just towards like human beings interacting with one another on a very base primitive level as being the genesis?
I think I think the genesis is, we developed from apes. We sort of like in the early stages. I'm no anthropologist. I'm no expert about this stuff, but like this is complete speculation on my part. Like I'm just like post hoc, like bringing this up right now. But like the way I see it, like I think that people like they came to being like, early human beings through their social interactions, which early on were less conditioned. They were sort of guided by their intrinsic senses and like their intrinsic feelings and whatnot, and those social bonds formed, and that produced social structures. And I think those social structures, as a product of human qualities, reified and expanded and manifested in new forms to perpetuate oppression. So like I think that even though it became so powerful that it dominates human nature, I think that it's more of a factor than human nature. I think that its genesis has a human character to it.
I think that you could say that, and yeah, that's fine.
I don't know, like to me this conversation, like when you're talking about non-empirical things, like I'm just like post hoc rationalizing something that like maybe I'm cucked by society and I'm like thinking that I have some level of autonomy or like I have some nature, but like I'm just post hoc rationalizing the fact that I feel like I have some degree of natural qualities as a human being that doesn't that can be independent of the structures that exist. Like I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm just worried that like I haven't been incredibly clear or like do you understand my point of view?
Let me try to like steel man. Like let me try to describe your position as
All
best
right.
I can. Okay, so you're saying that okay. All right. So you're saying that human beings um their values and their behaviors are inculcated by broader structures that perpetuate themselves independent of human exertion, and that human nature and what we perceive to be human nature is simply a byproduct of these external phenomenon, and the unconscious feelings we have are also merely just a non-conscious form of reflections of an external world, and um we are basically producing machines that reproduce desires that are independent of conscious self-directed will. Or is that like I don't know.
Basically, like yeah, that's not a bad uh summarization of it.
Okay. Like I know I need to get into Deleuze. Like I have answered this, but like I'm very it's just a very hard to digest thing. So like I'm not really I don't know.
I really like reading it. I should read it. I should get back into it because I've like stopped and been like reading other things and like reading for school, but for whatever reason, like that complicated, deep philosophy just really like resonates with me. Probably more because of the subject matter and the theories that are actually in the book. Because like his concepts or their concepts of like desire and territorialization and all of that are just very, um, like I don't know how to. There's not really a word for it, but like the phenomenon of like when you read something and it explains things that you were already thinking in a way that's more like eloquent, and also like it gives you the words for thoughts that you didn't have words for before, basically. Like that's kind of the experience that I get when I read that.
Yeah, that's like a lot of philosophy for me. Whereas like it's almost like these way smarter philosophers are like explaining to you concepts that you thought from a younger age. Like you just weren't able to express it in the articulate fashion. Like
Yeah.
I feel like that's like what the best philosophy is able to do, like make you like realize like this thing that was in my head, like there's this sort of grain of reality to it that can be expressed in a sort of abstract or like in a developed fashion.
Right.
I don't know, I hope I did better than Noam Chomsky in defending human nature, Foucault debate, but like
Well, we did. I mean, we basically came to a certain kind of reconciliation. Like our positions are just two different analytical frameworks for looking at the same thing.
yeah, that's true, yeah.
But are we finished now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I think good length of time. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Do you want to come back on sometime? That'd be great.
Yeah, of course. I'd love
Awesome.
to.
Okay.
All right, see ya.
And don't forget to subscribe to her channel, everybody. Even though my
Yeah, of
channel is
course.
like way smaller.
It's totally fine. Yeah. I'll probably upload this on my channel too, so subscribe to Madeline.
Awesome.
Yep. But it'll probably just be a like video of my face recording the audio of this debate. But like,
That's
yeah.
fine, yeah. Okay.
Anyway, have a good day.
You too.